impacting our uh,
Rather.
over the past couple of years, and also where we think 2024 is trending towards in terms of what we're going to see in the in the comp sector. And I'm going to focus most of my comments. OpenComp works with a wide variety of companies, but we do kind of have a specialty focus, one of many in the high tech technology sector. So some of my comments will be specific to that sector, and then others will be kind of a broad, all industry encompassing insights.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds good. And thank you for joining us, Jason. Would love to hear an introduction about yourself and your background and all of your expertise. Would also love to hear more about OpenComp and what the company does.
Yeah, I'll kind of speak about my background, and David, as our marketing guru, he can give you a nice kind of overview of what OpenComp is all about. But me personally, my background, I've been in the comp world for a ridiculous amount of time. 1992 is the only job I've ever had. I started in college, and I focused on executive and board of directors compensation. I've only worked for the most part on the consulting side, a couple of small stints kind of in-house on the on the HR side, but for the last 15 years or so, I moved away from executive comp and really into broad-based comp, specifically in the tech startup world. So all things compensation. Most of the work that I've done has been assisting companies as they kind of begin to navigate the comp journey. These are companies that are growing very rapidly. They're trying to get HR policies and practices in place so that they can more easily scale. And we've partnered with them sort of on the front end of that journey, where they might not have had too much staff from an HR, from a comp perspective. And we really work together to set things up in terms of evaluating pay, in terms of establishing a comp philosophy, hiring strategy, all that kind of fun stuff. So that's what I've been doing for about the past 15 years, and the last three of which have been with OpenComp. And David can give a little more background on the wonderful things that we're doing at OpenComp.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Jason. We're very pleased to be here with the Talent Collective Group. OpenComp develops what we refer to as compensation decision software that helps organizations and companies essentially transition all the way through the comp journey, from gaining access to up-to-date market data to building pay strategies, and then essentially operationalizing those pay strategies in their organizations with their workforce through workflow-related compensation tools that include total reward statements, merit cycle solutions, and offer letters. But the real kernel of it starts with the market data that we have compiled through a cooperative of companies furnishing their data to us, and that Jason masterfully builds into a very comprehensive benchmark. The shameless plug is you can sign up for a free trial account at opencomp.com if you haven't already done so, and get access to the full platform for 14 days for free.
Well, thank you so much. And I see a lot more people are starting to join here. So just wanted to say, as you start to enter, you can feel free to put your name, your LinkedIn profile, maybe where you're joining from in the chat. We'd love to meet you all and have you all connect with each other. One thing also to note, this is an Ask Me Anything, so please put your questions in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on those, and we can ask Jason after he's done with a short presentation. Also, there will be SHRM credits given for this presentation. So After the session, we'll send out a recording of the session for those of you who can't attend the whole thing. And then we'll also send out your SHRM activity ID for this session. So thank you all again for joining. And thank you, Jason, for being here and teaching us all a thing or two about the very complicated world of compensation. And thank goodness there are people like you out there, because a lot of this is way over my head. So let's dive in here. So Jason, you can take it away with your presentation here.
Okay. Thanks for the intro, Krista. Yeah, it's pretty spectacular last couple of years in terms of what's been going on in the comp world. And being in the business for 30 years, I've not seen such a confluence of different forces that have kind of come together at once to affect what we do as comp professionals. It really started a couple of years ago with COVID, right? And then COVID led to companies overhiring, which led to the economy kind of overheating and inflation. So that's really the top headline here I want to talk about is about inflation and consumer prices. Obviously that's been on most people's minds. You guys have, as HR professionals, probably have had, a lot more employees come to you and say, hey, I just, can't afford my life as it used to be. I need a raise. So for 2022, inflation averaged 8%, and that was the highest in well over 20 years. Historically, inflation in the US has been super low, the 2-3%, sometimes even lower. 2023, it fell a bit to just over 4%, but still quite high by historical standards. I think the numbers just came out for February, and they were a little bit higher than was expected. They were at 3.2. But most economists, this is kind of not my area of expertise, but I follow the people that predict these numbers. Most economists think that by the end of 2024, we'll be back down to 2.5%. So that has significant implications, obviously, for the compensation environment, and we'll get into that a little bit further down here on the list. The second key factor that I want to emphasize is that the labor market continues to remain tight, and especially for top talent. These are your technical roles, your software engineers, machine learning, product managers. Those are still going to be, as we see it, extremely difficult to find talent for. Coupled with that, in 2024, obviously the tech sector has been in quite a bit of a funk, for lack of a better word, the past couple of years. But we're cautiously seeing in 2024, a bit of that veil lifting a bit, improving business conditions, improving funding. And part of what is an outgrowth of that is that we're going to see an increase in 2024 in employees' ability to be mobile. So job hopping, this was a huge thing before COVID, 3, 4, 5 years ago, where you'd have an employee literally say, hey, I can go across the street, make 10,000 more, and you'd have to give that person a raise, or otherwise they leave on the spot. So I don't see us going back to that level, but contrary to where we've been the past couple of years, employees have been fairly content to stay put and kind of weather out the storm, so to speak. So we're going to see a little bit of a change in that, which is going to have implications, especially when we're coupling this with the consumer price surge over the past year. Another thing we're seeing that's a pretty dramatic change from the past couple of years is, for the tech sector, for startups, funding really fell off the cliff over the past couple of years. For a lot of companies, it stopped entirely, but on average, funding declined about 70%. So that's a significant drop from what we've seen historically, which has generally been a steady growth every year. One of the outgrowths of that are pay freezes were fairly common. The companies that we work with in OpenComp, about 40% last year implemented pay freezes. And many of those, in order to maintain their competitive abilities to retain talent, they used equity in lieu of cash. So in other words, hey, if you're at $100,000, instead of me, the employer, giving you a $10,000 increase, I will give you however many shares that translates to in equity. And this really was these companies really didn't have the choice. Their cash runways were kind of running out. So really they had to do this to maintain talent. And I think that worked for 2023. It's going to work less well in 2024 due to these factors that we've been going through. Merit increases, not surprisingly, because consumer prices surged so significantly in 2022. We saw the highest increase in salary increases in 23 years, 4.5% on average in 2023. This historically, in my career, has been typically around the 3 to 3.5%. But there's really a more complex story behind those numbers. What we've seen is a kind of a dichotomy between what I call the haves and the have-nots. The companies that did not have the cash, the companies that had to make salary freezes, obviously those were more on the zero increase, merit increase. And then the companies that did have the money, a lot of these were well-funded startups or public companies. I have clients that one of them made 10% increases across the board, 6, 7, 8%, certainly not uncommon. So you really have this bifurcation of ones that made very little or no increases, and then ones that had the cash that made those fairly significant increases, 6% on average, that enabled their employees' spending power to not deteriorate too much. But this will be a factor for those companies that did not have the cash. That'll be a factor in 2024. I think increasingly something that we're kind of advising our clients to start to look out for. Finally, pay transparency. We're continuing to see legislation there, but largely, in my opinion, this it hasn't been as spectacular as we thought it would be. It's kind of fizzled out a bit, and the reason for that is that companies that have implemented pay transparency, just due to the nature of the regulations, it enabled companies to be fairly loosey-goosey with their pay transparency. For example, just posting super wide ranges like, oh, this job pays 50,000 to 500. So really nothing that's useful for anyone. But importantly, we've seen from our research with OpenComp customers that the employees, they still want that pay transparency. More candidates reporting an unwillingness to apply for positions that don't have kind of that salary range information. And that really comes down to the trust that potential candidates want to see their employers have in them, and vice versa. Implications. I know this is a terrible cliche, and I've probably been saying this for 15 years, but I think it is more important now. But hey, it is very important now to get pay right. Just having this delicate balance where we still have a very, very historically strong labor market, coupled with the financial uncertainty, and also, most importantly, employees having, as we are beginning to see it, more mobility and more options in 2024. So instead of employees being content to sit put. I think we're going to find some more cautious forays out there into the job world. So as an employer, it's something that that's going to be critical for you to monitor and understand why it's happening. So critical steps, obviously getting the pay right is something that we see as a must do. Making sure that your employees are benchmarked and that they are paid competitively versus the market, and also in line with your company's compensation philosophy. Obviously, focus on the key roles and top performers. I like to kind of throw out what I call the 80-20 rule, which is that 80% of budget for both cash and stock. If you're doing things right and have a performance-based culture, 80% of that will go towards the employees that are kind of top performers and in those key roles, with the other 20% being spread out through the rest of the organization. That's not a hard and set rule, but it's something that companies that we work with that are extremely performance driven, they like to manage to that 80-20 rule. This one's important, is taking a look at the voluntary attrition, why employees are leaving the company. Is it due to comp, company culture, potentially just not having career progression opportunities? So being able to closely understand every employee that leaves, why they're leaving, and developing that database and understanding kind of what the value proposition is for you as an employer is something critical that's going to enable you not just retain those employees who announce they want to leave, but also attract new talent going forward. And finally, comp philosophy. We've always emphasized that to have that kind of developed at a very early stage.
Not down, please.
Yep, to have the comp philosophy and pay strategy built out and to assure it aligns with the company's current financial condition and overall macroeconomic trends in both the economy and the labor market.
All right. Well, perfect. Thank you for all of this, Jason. We've been getting some comments and questions in the chat, and I was thinking we could start with some questions that I received last night and early this morning first. Then we can go into the chat ones, and keep them coming, everyone. If you have questions for Jason, feel free to put them in the chat as we go. So one of the questions that I received ahead of time is curious about general trends that you're seeing in comp, which I think we just went over, but the approach that public companies are taking to be competitive, and this is multi-layered, but what companies are no longer offering in this market because they don't have to, and then some long-term considerations that teams should be making when creating or making their comp philosophy and plan.
Yeah, good question. For public companies, I've seen a couple things declining, a couple things increasing. One of the things that I've seen over the past year or two that's increasing is equity. Equity has become a little more important than it has been. And that part of that is because the public companies, the tech startup world has been in this funk, so it has not been doing well. But if you look at the S&P 500, the NASDAQ, a lot of technology companies are doing extremely well with their stock prices. So they've been able to leverage that in making offers and in making merit increases to employees. And also, having the cash, a lot of these companies helps as well. So that's one thing. We've seen more competition on equity side, whereas traditionally it's been the startup that's been able to provide large amounts of equity, and the public company has had to kind of throw in more cash to keep up. But now it's a bit inverted, just given the uncertainty in the startup world. I really see the public companies having the competitive advantage at this point in time. Couple things in public companies that we've seen have decreased. Probably the most significant one that you guys have read headlines, not really a comp thing, but just requiring employees to spend more time in office or eliminating remote work entirely for some companies. That's been something that's really spiked over the past year, really since the end of COVID. The second one that I've seen is a decrease in signing bonuses, both in the amount and the frequency. And a lot of that is because from a competitive perspective, it's not as necessary. And as I mentioned, the public companies, they're leveraging with more equity and are also able to provide fairly competitive cash amounts, so that they're really not having as many signing bonuses. And also the notion of negotiating when you're coming in and you're given an offer, that's declined a bit. I know of a few companies, public companies, that have eliminated that altogether, negotiation, that there's just one offer, here it is, take it or leave it. And I think that's going to continue as a trend. It makes sense. I mean, from the perspective of the back and forth of negotiation, it just really, if you're a large company hiring a lot, it's not scalable if you're going through that process, every time. And also from a budgetary perspective, it becomes difficult to manage when you've different offers going out and signing bonuses and the like. From the perspective of, I'd say, the tech startup world, I think I mentioned through the intro, we've seen a fairly significant increase in equity in lieu of cash programs. And again, this was driven, as I mentioned, by necessity, with companies not necessarily having the cash budget to be able to make merit increases or generous offers, resorting to equity to be able to bridge that gap. So that's been significant. I see that kind of continuing in prevalence through this year. The second thing I'd say that just comes to mind is we're not seeing as many as these lavish perks that tech companies have instituted. And I'm not talking like about the free sushi. I'm talking about the life coaching, the personal shoppers, the pet care. We've really seen a decrease in those fairly unusual perks, and certainly companies that are starting up, those are not being offered as much as they were, say, 5 years ago. And really, yeah.
I was just going to ask a follow-up on that. Are perks like, the learning and development stipends or reimbursements or work from home equipment, things like that, are companies still tending to offer those types of perks or benefits?
Yes. No, those we still see, those are common. And for the companies that did implement some of these more lavish perks, most of them, you introduce something like that, it's hard to take it away.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Most of them have continued to offer those, but in terms of the new companies that are now competing with them for talent, they're finding they don't necessarily have to offer those anymore.
Real quick question, Jason, I want to take a step back to all of the data that you presented in the beginning. Someone had asked in the chat, is that location specific? And we know that this is coming from your clients. So is that all over the US or certain, geographical locations?
No, generally all over the US.
Okay.
But in the tech world, as most of you know, as the Bay Area does, everybody else tends to follow. But yeah, so a lot of these changes begin with companies in the Bay Area, but very quickly are adopted nationally by most companies.
Okay, great. So moving on, another question that I received this morning. So with inflation and other economic factors continuing to increase, as you mentioned, I think this one you've already touched on actually, but how are compensation trends reacting or not reacting to that? Anything additional to add to what you've already mentioned?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's really where I see the risk, as a comp professor, the companies that did not have the cash to make those increases, to keep their salaries, to enable their employees to have the same purchasing power. So the ones that froze the pay last year, and maybe they did give some more equity in lieu of cash, but really this year, because there's going to be an improvement a bit, we hope, in the financial climate and in job mobility. This year, they're really going to have to put their money where their mouth is to keep the talent, and it's gonna be a fairly challenging position, I think, for some companies.
You mentioned just a minute ago about negotiating and some public companies, transitioning to just here's your one offer, take it or leave it. I've actually heard the same thing with multiple startups starting to do that as well, and just saying like, this is our best offer and here's what it is. And really, prepping candidates in the beginning of the process to make sure they understand that. Another question we have here about negotiating. So this individual was listening to a podcast that spoke about part of the book Lean In, and discussed the negotiation gap, referring to the difference in what folks typically will or won't negotiate. And it mentioned that the data has shown that this gap has mostly changed over the last few years. I'd love to understand your recommendations on negotiating or not, and the impact on pay equity.
Yeah, we've seen that gap narrow pretty consistently over the past couple of years, and having these large public tech companies come out and say no more negotiation, that's been a catalyst. That I think, Krista, you mentioned some startups adopting the no negotiation, but I think that's a reflection of just the general employers and employees embracing pay transparency. Right? If we truly have pay transparency, that negates any need for negotiation, because you know exactly what that job is worth. So I think that's an outgrowth of transparency being more widely embraced and accepted in the US.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks for that. And the next question pivots a little bit to executive compensation packages. So as we negotiate executive compensation packages, I found that over the year that the comp platforms and companies always seem to be below the market. Thoughts on this and how you stay on top of real world compensation, in particular the sales OTEs?
Yeah, executive comp is kind of its own unique beast, as most of you probably know. But it has moved up a bit higher than general employee pay has over the past couple of years. So it is a little bit difficult to keep up with from looking at comp surveys. I'll kind of just plug OpenComp, that our data is real time, and it's compiled and refreshed. So I think versus published surveys, we probably have a little better understanding in terms of what pay data is now. For larger companies, being an executive comp consultant and board consultant for 15 years, one of my recommendations has always been to use survey data as simply one source when you're looking at executive comp, but also to look at public company data, which is all disclosed through proxy statements, and doing an analysis of what pay looks like. And that involves, if you're a small startup, it would involve looking at other small public companies that are in your industry, that are fairly close financially or in terms of headcount, developing that peer group, and then taking a look at the executive comp and really triangulating between where that number is as a public company and where the survey data is indicating, and coming up with an approach that looks at looks at both angles. Executive comp, I always recommend the more data you can get, the better. For broad-based comp, my advice is the opposite. It's like find a great source and stick with it.
Stick with it. I'm curious, you mentioned just now about OpenComp's platform and how it's real-time data. How does that work? Is that because it's like integrated with your clients like HRISs or? Yep. Okay.
Exactly. Yep. So we have the HRIS integration, and that links with our market data. So that's updated.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Whereas most surveys, as you know, it's if a survey comes out, say now in March of 2024, it's likely the effective date of that survey is sometime, maybe last June. So typically there's a 9-month or sometimes longer lag in the data. And with executive comp, the way it's been moving, it moved about probably 8 or 10% last year. One thing you can do if the data is a bit stale is to just simply apply kind of a higher premium to that data to age it up to where it should be as of today.
Mm-hmm. Great. So the next question is actually about comp philosophy, and this was a question in the chat, which I'd love to get to, but I think prior to this, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Jason, kind of like more big picture about comp philosophy, and we could probably do an entire session just on this. So, in a couple minutes, how would you recommend going about building a compensation philosophy at a company? Like, what do you need to consider? What do you need to get really clear on? Who needs to be involved?
Yeah, it's something that really needs to involve all the key leadership of the company. The CEO, the CFO is particularly important because obviously there are budgetary implications for a comp philosophy. We like to have, to the extent that you have a fairly engaged board, we'd highly recommend that they get involved and other stakeholders get involved in the process, because once you develop a comp philosophy, it's something that hopefully, if it's developed right, is going to maintain over a course of a couple of years, and it's not something that you want to change and tweak every year. So it's important to get it right. Part of that is having all the stakeholders, having as many people that have a say in this be part of it. And the ones that I've seen that have not been as successful have been ones that have been developed, maybe in a silo within just the HR function or just the CEO. It's something that you want to have your recruiters involved with as well, because they provide valuable feedback as to what your value proposition as a company. Why are we not hiring people? Why are people leaving? Those are important things that go into a comp philosophy, as is really the notion of company culture. Are we a company that is driven by performance, right? And we want to reward those people more? Or are we more of a, hey, everybody is pulling their weight, everybody's equal? And those are going to have significant implications in what your comp philosophy looks like. But generally, for a comp philosophy, we see companies in terms of their size, typically once they get to around, I'd say 80 or 100 employees is when we see most companies say, hey, we really gotta get on the ball.
I got it.
A comp philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So this sub question, and I'm not sure I exactly understand it. And Gina, thank you so much for putting so many questions in here, but we'll take a stab at answering it. But if we got it wrong at all, definitely feel free to unmute and elaborate a little bit.
I didn't mean to torture you, I promise.
No, I love all your questions. So this one goes into comp philosophy. So do you find most employees or candidates even know how a compensation philosophy affects them when interviewing. This is an area I find most individuals aren't even aware of. Example, Amazon.
I 100% agree. Yeah, I think from the candidate perspective, it's often not understood. But it's something that I see, it's kind of the roadmap for the board, for the executive leadership. Everything else falls into your comp philosophy in terms of executing your business plan. So it's something that in the leadership group I generally see is most fluent in comp philosophy, along with HR. But it's something that, is difficult for average employees or from candidates to understand. But a lot of times it's distilled down very succinctly into, we pay 75th at market on cash, we pay 50th on equity. We provide refresh grants every 2 years. We do XYZ for performance. Oftentimes it's more easy to communicate if it's distilled down into just a couple of components that are easily understood by candidates.
Great. Hopefully, Gina, was that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Thank you. I think it was more about, we're being so transparent about comp on job descriptions, which we can have a whole conversation on that. I just find it fascinating that philosophy isn't ever publicly discussed. Very, very few people, even the recruiters within, and we're discussing Amazon, they don't know what a comp philosophy is and how that affects your negotiation. So I was just curious if then any of that more feely type information comes out in some of your surveys. I was just curious about that.
No, you're absolutely right. It really, it is something that maintains a little, it's a bit opaque in terms of comp philosophy, but public companies, they'll actually disclose it in their proxy. So it's pretty interesting reading, but a lot of it is very boilerplate. If you look at major companies, it looks like a lot of them copy one another in terms of that comp philosophy. So I hate to say it as a comp professional, but there's some degree of just lip service in the comp philosophy. It's like, well, we have to have one, so let's just put something together, and people might not understand it, but there it is. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's transition a bit to like geolocation, location-based pay. So what are you seeing in regards to companies implementing geolocation filters on salary?
That's a good question. Yeah, because that's something where we've seen a lot of changes over the past couple of years. And primarily, we've seen the notion of geographic differentials have become more contracted. And the reason for that, largely the remote-driven exodus, COVID, et cetera. You didn't have to live in the Bay Area and pay $5,000 for a studio anymore. You could live anywhere, and because of that, there are more talent pockets across the U.S., especially in engineering and also in sales. So we've seen a contraction. I'd say probably 5 years ago, we were recommending to customers and clients a 4-tiered system, which had your premium cities, your San Francisco, New York. Then you'd have 2nd tier, which is your LA, Seattle. 3rd tier, which would be your Houstons, and then 4th tier would be Miami or New Orleans, cities like that. But now what we've seen over the past 2 years is a lot of my clients have gone to a 2-tier geo strategy, where it's really just premium cities, which is your New York, San Francisco, sometimes Boston is in there, sometimes DC, and then all others, and not having each location have a different pay, which it makes sense from a administrative perspective. It's difficult to maintain if you've got 4 different geo strategies. But really what's driving that is the market. It just isn't as necessary as it was 5 years ago. So I think we're going to continue to see a contraction in geo spread between U.S. cities.
Yeah, and to add on to that, somebody had asked about what you're seeing in regards to location-based pay, especially in tech, which I think you covered. This person had said, I see companies making splashy announcements that they will no longer do location-based pay, but since times are tight all over, I assume they must be dropping the targeted percentile of the reference market to afford it.
I'd say that's a safe, that's probably a safe assumption. Yeah.
Great. And so this one was also from Gina. She's in Seattle. And so talking about the Pacific Northwest region, we have found that most all job classifications have increased 100K per title a couple of years ago and haven't decreased. Have you seen this? That's what they're seeing in the Pacific Northwest.
We've seen that pay went up by a ton, and the thing about pay is that I've never seen it go down. So once it goes up, it rarely goes back the other way. I haven't seen that.
Sadly, except for recruiters. I've been seeing the recruiter pay ranges quite low these days, and I think companies are trying to just get more bang for their buck and say they want someone junior, but they're really trying to just decrease, the overall spend.
Yeah, and that's one bright spot for these companies that maybe did not make increases last year, to the extent that they already had made significant increases and were pretty high in the market, that they probably still might have a little more wiggle room before they have to start making increases again, because their pay was already so high.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat at this time. So I have another additional question I'd love to find out from you. So talking about pay equity, or even just paying people fairly. So if you are able to, you do identify that you're not really paying people fairly, what are some steps that you can take if you aren't, and how can you get there?
Yeah, well, we recommend that even if you have a suspicion that there might be unfair pay going on, is to really dig into the numbers and analyze whether it is a risk to the company, because not having equitable pay, it's not a very tenable position from our perspective today. So it's something you want to get right. So even if there is an inkling that something might be amiss, pay some overpriced consultant like me to come in and and run the numbers and do a pay equity analysis, so you can understand where your risk is. And then the advice is to the extent that there is risk, really you have to map that obviously over employee performance. But once that is done, is to make those adjustments as quickly as you can.
Great, thank you. So we have a few minutes left here. If anyone wants to drop another question or two in the chat, we would welcome that. Another question for you, Jason. What do you think some common mistakes are? What do you see, some of your maybe clients or people that you talk to, common mistakes companies make when developing their comp philosophy? And what do you think they can do to avoid these, or other companies can do to avoid these mistakes?
Yeah, I think the biggest mistake that I've seen is having a disconnect between your philosophy in terms of where we want to be, and the actual ability, right, in terms of finances to get there. So it's really thinking you want to be up here, but your budget says you really need to be down here. That's the most common mistake that I see, is that the ideals can be kind of lofty in a comp philosophy, but really they need to be tempered with the reality of what we as a company can afford. And it's okay to have the lofty ideals, but not to expect that you're going to get there, you know, within a year or fairly quickly. But as long as you have the understanding that, hey, we want to be up here, we know realistically we're here, but we gradually want to see that move up to where we want to be, and that's a healthy approach to have for a comp philosophy.
Great. Thank you, Jason. One more question that has come through. So for globally distributed startups, what are the best practices when defining geo factors for non-US markets?
Yeah, really, it's all about getting the data for the non-US markets, getting the most accurate data and understanding where the market is. For smaller companies, I would say the most common approach is doing a discount off of HQ, understanding, for example, where London is, and assigning a percent of where pay should be versus, say, HQ if it's in the Bay Area. You know, your London pay might be 70%, Madrid might be 60%, et cetera. But once companies get to a point where they are hiring locally in international markets, that's when we recommend that instead of having that discount approach, they start to get more granular data on what the local market looks like in those areas, and you know, start to integrate that into setting the pay targets.
Great. Also, there's been a couple of comments and now a question about cost of labor versus cost of living. So do you have recommendations for helpful resources when explaining cost of labor versus cost of living when addressing comp bands and or increases?
You know, I think I just saw this on Google. If you Google that, there's some pretty good explanations as to the difference that are pretty succinct. So there's a lot of stuff out there on the difference in the meaning between those two. Yeah.
Great. And then Gina did a follow-up. I believe this is a yes, Gina, but when you were talking about not negotiating an offer, were those mostly public traded? I have never heard that we negotiate every engagement, and some of our companies are disappointed when the candidate doesn't counter. Just curious about this.
Yeah, I'd say it started with public companies, with larger public companies, but Krista, you said you've seen it in some private startups. I've seen it pop up more and more, but I think it definitely is something that is more common in the public company world for right now.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's not across the board, but maybe a trend that's starting to take place, I would say.
Yeah, and the reason for that is public companies, obviously, they have very deep resources in terms of having, you know, staff, comp professionals, and they really understand where the market is very specifically versus a smaller startup whose roles might be changing or emerging. It's a little bit more nebulous to understand exactly where market is. So I think we're going to continue to see, you know, more companies maintaining this negotiative quality to the employee-employer relationship.
Great, thank you. Well, looks like I think we're all wrapped up here. So just wanted to give one last thank you to Jason for giving us all of these nuggets of wisdom and helping us understand what the greater market is doing right now. Thank you to everyone who attended. We will be sending out a link to the recording, so if you only got to part of it, you'll be able to see the whole thing. And for anyone who is looking for SHRM credits, we will also send out the SHRM activity ID information, as well as Jason's email address. So if you have any follow-up questions for him, or if there's anything that OpenComp can do to help you, feel free to reach out. And for those of you who don't know what Talent Collective is, we are a community for women and those who identify as women in the recruiting space. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, please connect with me. I'd be happy to chat with you. Thank you again to everybody. This was an amazing session. Really, really appreciate all you've done for us today, Jason.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jay.